Well, the 22nd of June, 2 days ago, marked the first anniversary of the release of the fifth and final part of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry's report looking into the capture of the South African state. The commission, which came at a cost of about 1 billion rand, revealed some of the adverse corruption, or found corruption, in fact, alleged corruption to have taken place in a wide space in terms of government departments and indeed state-owned enterprises. The commission has seen some of the most serious allegations of graft and corruption under the watch of government workers. We ask whether efforts by whistleblowers and journalists in uncovering these have gone to waste. We can speak now to a journalist who's focused very much on the issue of whistleblowers as relates to the murder, in particular, of Babita Deokaran. Investigative reporter Jeff Wicks joining us this morning. Jeff, very good morning to you. Thank you for your time. So I wonder if it was ever a realistic expectation, given this country's track record with accountability and justice, that 1 year on we would have seen major progress in these cases.
Yes, I think you make a valid point. And I think if we just examine this current status quo of where we are now, a year later, we have come out of this commission with very little to show for it in terms of accountability. It's difficult for me to say it's a complete waste, however, because the import of a commission like this is across many tropes. And one key and important factor is that it pushes issues of state capture, of malfeasance and of corruption into the public view, and we, as the media, then have a responsibility to inform the public of what is happening with our state and how the taxpayers' rand is being spent.
And whenever these issues are raised, you're told by the likes of Parliament that efforts are afoot. The presidency will say it's also doing its bit. The prosecuting bodies will say they too are doing investigative work and don't want to rush to any conclusions because they want a watertight case. Is there merit to those responses?
I think there is value in those responses, with specific reference to the last one, where a body like the National Prosecuting Authority will say, let's build a solid case, let's not have an embarrassing situation where it's withdrawn mid-trial. However, what the South African citizenry needs is accountability, and they need to see justice being done. And in terms of acting on state capture allegations, the Investigating Directorate and the NPA have had a modicum of success, but it's not nearly where it should be. And that, again, links back to capacity issues. And institutions like the NPA were denuded during state capture, so it becomes cyclical, and that's problematic. What we need is fresh action and actual movement on these prosecutions, because without accountability, we foster a repeat of this happening.
But all of that means sweet little, doesn't it, to people who basically risk their lives and careers to expose much of the malfeasance, because as they sit today, when you speak to many of them, apart from being invited for interviews or to appear on platforms for those who are alive, they are unemployable. They are basically being punished for exposing what happened. So to look 1 year on and see that no one has been made to pay must hurt.
Absolutely. And I mean, the importance of whistleblowers was codified by the Zondo Commission. Chief Justice Zondo was at pains to describe how if we do not protect whistleblowers, they will not be there to help us when there's the potential for state capture once more. A perfect example of this is Prasa's Martha Ngoyi. She blew the whistle on dodgy train contracts, and she's been persecuted since. And she has had to shoulder an immense financial burden, an immense emotional burden, and she is without work. And that is not a unique situation. Journalists have relied on whistleblowers as sources, and the country and the media owes whistleblowers a massive debt. But it is somewhat of a snub, and it will no doubt have a chilling effect on whistleblowers to see that they risk life, livelihood, and limb to stand against corruption, and then when they do report it, they're ostracized, and those perpetrating the crimes are free to just wonder.
And given that context, then, the question remains whether or not it's a worthwhile endeavor when you've got so little to gain. In fact, you risk persecution and perhaps even murder.
Absolutely. And I mean, when we talk about a nexus between organized crime, murder and corruption, Babita Deokaran's case is a perfect example of that. And the tragic reality of that case is that there's been very little, if any accountability in terms of a police investigation aimed at bringing the paymaster of her assassination to book. We've got 6 men who were arrested days after the killing. They have yet to go to trial. That matter sits next month. But in terms of who paid them to execute this woman, the police investigation stalled days after it started. And that tells us several things. Number one, perhaps there's a capacity issue within the police, perhaps they're incompetent, or there's no will to investigate this matter. And you know, the reality of this is that this should be a blight on the Hawks' record. They've failed the Deokaran family dismally here, and the ramifications of their failure will be widespread, because every potential whistleblower who has any gumption to stand up against wrongdoing in their government departments or municipalities across the country will now really think twice about taking that risk after seeing what's happened to Babita Deokaran and knowing that nothing has been done to trace her killers.
And what the murder of Babita Deokaran, the assassination of Deokaran, a whistleblower of corruption in the Gauteng government during the COVID-19 period, also reminds us is that corruption did not end in this country with the end of the previous administration, or indeed the various hearings by the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. It continues because even in your reporting, you've detailed a network of people who basically ignored what she was saying, and it could be argued that even covered for one another, even when someone was saying, hang on a minute, something has gone wrong at a moment of crisis in the country.
Absolutely. It would be so naive of us to think that state capture is over. It is certainly not. What we've seen is a changing of the guard in terms of the villains behind state capture. But it's become so endemic. And Babita Deokaran's case shows that. When you look at expenditure out of a single hospital and the dubious nature of these payments worth nearly R1 billion, and that's just out of one hospital in one province. You know, it talks about a corruption of the civil service, because in order for this specific case and these extraction networks to work, they needed people on the inside, and not one person. The entire network had to be captured. And but for Babita Deokaran, we would not know about this. And in terms of accountability, again, there's been little to none. We have identified companies, part of extraction syndicates, that pulled 250 million rand out of that hospital in 2 years, controlled by one family. They were still being paid after we exposed them, months afterwards. Not a single company Babita identified has been blacklisted, so nothing stops them from doing business with other hospitals or other departments or other provinces. So there's a distinct lack of accountability, and it leads us along a path to becoming a mafia state, and that is where things become dangerous.
It's also a reminder, Jeff, is it not, that we often think of corruption in perhaps grander terms, for want of a better phrase, where we're looking for the link to a president, a minister, but at provincial and local government level, much of the feeding, much of the looting is actually located in that space. And I wonder if it's perhaps people at that level think that they can get away with it precisely because we are rightfully focused on what national figures are doing.
Of course, and I think another thing that leads into that is the fact that people have become desensitized to corruption. You start looking for figures stolen on a grand scale, when the extent of the problem is masked because it's happening everywhere, and small numbers that go unnoticed. You know, this Tembisa hospital scheme had been running for years, and it was ingenious because they kept the figures low enough and just multiplied the numbers of orders. When they got greedy, they got caught. But in effect, this was operating for between 4 to 5 years before someone noticed it. And, you know, that's why I say it's impossible to gauge the true extent of corruption in the South African context, and it's also impossible to gauge what the true cause and effect is going to be of the inability of the police to properly investigate Babita Deokaran's murder. Because the reality of the situation is now that any potential whistleblower is going to be chilled seeing what was done to Babita Deokaran, that she died without protection after blowing the whistle, and nothing has been done since then, and we're now 2 years on.
State capture and corruption have not ended. You've got cases such as that of Babita Deokaran, a whistleblower allegedly killed precisely because she wanted corruption to be addressed in the Gauteng government. Are we likely going to need another Zondo Commission of Inquiry? And given what he's told us with his team in the last year, I wonder if his comments this week are helpful or doing damage to the cause for justice.
I think the truth can never damage. And in reality, Chief Justice Zondo is correct. What we need is a proper capacitation of the police and the National Prosecuting Authority, because the South African public needs results. People who have taken money meant for the poor and destitute, diverted it to buy palatial properties and sports cars, need to be inside of a cell, because accountability is going to be the best deterrent in our context.
I want to then talk to you about another worrying story of corruption developing in the country outside of government. The University of Fort Hare, we've already seen officials there also killed, allegedly because they wanted to put an end to the looting. Today you've got a report out, in fact, with the team about how the University of Fort Hare spent 50,000 rand on takeaways for SRC functions in just 2 months, and a dodgy staff member was allegedly linked to the supplier. Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, again, we're talking about whistleblowers, and, whilst roles are clearly defined, perhaps the current University of Fort Hare VC, Sakela Buhlungu, could be considered a whistleblower, because he inherited an institution where extraction networks were well entrenched, and he moved to begin cleaning them up, and it's taken years. And now what we're seeing in the past couple of weeks is a distinct pushback from the political ruling class, specifically Oscar Mabuyane, the Premier of the Eastern Cape, because the SIU investigation that's currently underway into that institution has drawn him in because of alleged academic fraud. And this SIU investigation, which he attempted to stop, first in its entirety and then only in regard to him, is looking at multiple extraction networks that have also been operating at that university unnoticed for years. So any pushback against a corruption probe should raise questions, and motivations should be interrogated there.
And in terms of what you've been digging into at Fort Hare, have we even got halfway through what's likely to have gone on as far as the looting of that institution, which, by the way, when you look at it, is not even one of the wealthiest institutions of higher learning in this country?
No, there's much more to be told in the University of Fort Hare story. And, again, we see a case where, corruption is not a victimless crime. People pay the price. And we've seen 2 people killed at the University of Fort Hare linked to corruption investigations, and attempt to stop those investigations. So there is a direct link here. And what we have shown in our investigations into Fort Hare thus far is that these extraction networks were widespread. They fed into actors in the SRC, and those actors are now before court charged with murder. So, this is, again, happening at one university. We need to look at what's happening at every university. Every state institution needs to be placed under a microscope in this context, because what we do find is extremely disquieting for what we don't know about.
Jeff Wicks, investigative journalist with News 24. Always good to speak to you, Jeff. Thank you.